Hey y'all, welcome back to Pretty Culture 101. Today we're going to talk about desirability. I am your host, Tanya. I'm the founder of NiaZamar and your wellness educator. I don't know we couldn't talk about beauty and gender and not talk about desirability because it all goes hand in hand, right? Like this is all, everything I'm talking about is just like you could draw a big map and say it's all connected. Nothing is separate, none of it. But today I really wanted to get into our ideas of how we understand desirability. And when we first started to come to an idea of what is desirable and not, I think about porn, like whatever y'all want to call it. But I think about how a lot of us have access to some version of it, whether it be via the internet, whether it be via, y'all know those networks, y'all know the ones that y'all saw when you were kids and you had your remote TV, your television remote, and you were like, last when your parents came in the room. It happens. Like I just have heard enough stories. I know that this happens. So we're being exposed to not just sex and sexuality so young. We're exposed to the ideas of desirability and beauty and who we see represented and who we see represented in ways, in different ways, right? Because we all know that ideas about what is beautiful and what is not beautiful is represented, but it's like you see who's dealt with in like soft ways and like nice like TLC, tender loving care kind of ways, and we see like who is like the titles for certain other types of people, right? And race plays into it, gender plays into it, body size plays into it, sexuality plays into it. It's just all of this stuff comes together where depending on what whoever is being positioned as the star in it, the type of scene or how they're treated will look different, which tells us not just about who is desirable, who is beautiful, and who we think is worthy of having a sexuality, but also how that sexuality should look. I remember when Gabby, can't remember her last name right now. I'm gonna drop it somewhere here so that I can reference her for real. Did a scene on television as a dark-skinned, fat, black woman, and she had a sex scene on TV, and people were like, what? Like, flabbergasted, and I remember her having to say something about it and be like, y'all, like, I have a sex life, like, I have a sexuality too, and it tells us our ideas about desirability and who we think fits into our slot of who is desirable and who is not. Ultimately, like, let's be 100%, we're talking about patriarchy and white supremacy and power. Power is at the nucleus of everything we're talking about. Power, because the deeper conversation here is who is powerful, who has power, who is going to own said power, who should embody it, and who should have ownership of it, and who is worthy of being owned and embodied in this way, right? So if the flat line of it talking about power, it's really our ideas of desirability is about the haves and the have-nots. Who has the power, who doesn't have the power. Who is desirable, who is not desirable. Who is worthy of sexual intimacy, and who is just going to be a quick... That's part of it, right? And we think about not just how that translates in terms of personal intimacy and sexuality and what happens in our private bedrooms, but we also think about how that translates into our media, how that translates into violence that happens against women, and what kinds of women violence happens against, and who we think is okay for that to happen to. It translates in just like, I'm thinking about domestic violence. I'm just thinking about so many different areas of life, brethren. There's so many areas of life where our ideas of desirability are not just about sex, it's about power. It actually turns into being about violence. It actually turns into being about how we treat people on a day-to-day basis. And if you can think back to your first moment that you started thinking about this, like when did you first start thinking about what beauty is and who is desirable? How old were you? Drop it below. Tell me, how old were you the first time you started thinking about beauty like this? Talking about desirability, understand it's not just limited to the idea of who you're attracted to. Sometimes we're like, oh, well, I have a right to date who I want to date and be attracted to who I want to be attracted to. Of course you do. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is how we teach children from a young age, and how, as we become adolescents and young adults, we start to see things that give us ideas, and how that then goes on to inform our worldview and perspectives. And that's just the baseline of all of it, right? Because a big part of what we're talking about is the ways that it transcends to become shame and guilt within our own lives. I think that folks, I'm trying to remember the person who started The Body's Not an Apology, and it's also a book, but The Body's Not an Apology, and then Roxanne Gay talks about this. All these folks who talk about fatness particularly, but also talk about beauty in this way and body positivity, they have to do this work. We have to do this work because of the guilt and shame that's attached to our beings and our sexualities and our bodies and our desirability or lack thereof. And even for folks who feel desirable, but in a way that's exotifying and doesn't allow for their humanity, there are real consequences and impacts of this. Whether those consequences be the violence that folks experience, consequences be mental health or overall wellness consequences, there are consequences for how we position desirability. And I think it's important when we talk about healing from this and dealing with this, that we understand we're not just talking about desirability. We're ultimately talking about power and who has and who doesn't have it, right? And therefore, who has access and who doesn't have access, who has safety and who doesn't have safety, who's deserving of tender, loving touch and care and being protected, and who isn't. How does that feed into rape culture, who we believe and who we don't believe, how certain women have been told that they couldn't have possibly been raped because based on their body size they have to have wanted it, because where else were they going to get it from? These kind of ideals are incredibly violent, but it comes from our ideas of what is desirable and what is not desirable, and how we treat people that we deem as undesirable. Happen, and when we see things on TV and we start to think, oh well, she wasn't going to get nobody else, so she should be... Like, when we start thinking things like that, because it comes up, that's when we have an opportunity to check ourselves and to heal ourselves, and to therefore act differently and teach other younger people different things. And just continuously being mindful from the things we say to people, the questions we ask people, being mindful of how we approach other people's bodies, being mindful with our partners who we're trying to navigate desirability and intimacy with, and how we care for their bodies in the ways that some of that socialization have been taught to us, and then how we bring it to our partners and how we treat them. How do we be more mindful and respectful and loving and caring in those interactions, so we're not bringing these really effed up ideals around desirability into our relationships in our bedrooms. It's definitely a thing, and I would love for folks to drop below how they're dealing with this, how they're dealing with this concept of desirability within their own lives, and how they're continuing to heal from it in the ways that it may have impacted them. So looking forward to your responses. Drop it below, and I'll see you in the next video. Love you. Peace.